Okay, well, Shabbat Shalom. Although we originally planned, for many of you who have been reading the newsletter, planned to have Susan Gladney here tonight, founder and leader of the Missouri Migrant Farm Worker Assistant Fund. Due to circumstances beyond her control and our control, we've had to reschedule her program to a future yet undetermined date. She is anxious to tell us the story of the migrant farm workers that she's done such tremendous work with. But instead tonight, we have our fifth speaker in our Education is Activism, Welcoming the Stranger, Immigration Justice, Jewish Values in Action, long title. We are excited to have Zachary Mueller join us. His work in this area is an essential piece in this education, in educating ourselves on the many issues related to legal immigration and its counterpart. Tonight, we're going to look at how our communities have organized to address these issues, the true issue of action. Zach is an expert in community organizing. For 7 years, he worked as an expert on anti-immigrant politics before joining States at the Core, which was an organization I had not heard of until I met Zach. He's a senior strategist with that group. STAC, as it's called, is a nonprofit partner that fills in gaps for community leaders and organizers across the country who are facing everything from white nationalist rallies to school board takeovers to political violence. These issues are beyond the scope and capacity of most local organizations. So STAC steps in with rapid and customized support for frontline groups building strategic, tailored, and bold plans so that they can take courageous action. Their mantra is strategize, organize, mobilize. He's been involved in community training all over the country, including the mobilization in Minneapolis. He's worked locally with groups like Boots on the Ground KC and Advocates for Immigrant Rights and Reconciliation, or AIR KC, which we hopefully will also hear more about in the future. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Zach was a mentee of CBT member Lenny Zeskin, blessed memory, and it was his wife, Carol Smith, who first introduced me to Zach, affectionately calling him one of Lenny's boys. One of the many people Lenny touched and who currently is seeking to continue Lenny's important work in social justice. Lenny's 2000, I'm giving a little book thing here. Lenny's 2009 book, Blood and Politics, is in preparation for being released in paperback and is being recognized as the seminal work it is, warning about what we are facing now. So without further ado, please welcome Zachary Mueller.
All right, I figured out how to do the slides. All right, I talk loud, so I move around and do a lot of vocalizing with my hands. Other coworkers of mine always joke that I'm always doing air traffic controlling as I'm doing presentations. So we'll probably have a lot of that tonight. I can't stop it. It's just part of how I present. Well, thank you all for having me here. It's a real honor to be here, to be invited to talk with you all tonight. As was mentioned, I've been doing immigration work for many, many years, and have been doing trainings with tens of thousands of people across the country in this moment over the last year, thinking about the overreach of ICE and immigration and this kind of different moment that we find ourselves in. So I really wanted to kind of start by grounding us here tonight, thinking about this new moment. Deportations are nothing new. Deportations have been happening inside of America for a long time. Folks have overstayed visas, they've been rounded up in different ways, but I think we are in a new moment here. And I think that new movement is about a scale and severity of what we are seeing. And really thinking about how what we are dealing with isn't going after a quote unquote worst of the worst, but thinking about a administration that is trying intentionally to have images of chaos and cruelty, about removing access to sensitive locations, allowing raids on churches, on schools, on hospitals, and thinking about the surveillance, prosecution, and deadly violence of nonviolent protesters who are standing up to try to protect their neighbors and their communities. And that's different. And I think that scale and that severity puts us in a new moment to think about new things. So, how did we get here? And I wanted to, some of this might be familiar to many of you over the last year, but I think it is important for us to really think about, if we're in a new moment, how do we get to this new moment? Last spring, there was a change. There was a choice that was made to have loud, indiscriminate raids, to go after people at Home Depots, at 7-Elevens. This was a conscious choice to switch from targeted enforcement to indiscriminate enforcement to create a scene of chaos in the streets. That was an intentional choice that was made. Then, over the summer, there was a lot of political capital that was spent to create the One Big Beautiful Bill, which had $170 billion on top of an agency that was already funded at historic levels. And then recently, in the last couple of weeks here, there's another $70 billion that was passed to DHS to give funding for detention of our neighbors, to give to ICE. And so I want to put it there because no matter about how some of the politics, some of the conditions might change over the next months and years, I get $7 in my pocket and it starts burning a hole. I'm trying to spend it. And we're talking about $170 billion burning a hole in the pocket of a government agency tasked with the idea of rounding up our neighbors. And so throughout the fall and into the winter, we see a bunch of different test cases of rolling out of the National Guard. We see different surge tactics about a way to create this kind of big scene of chaos and fear, intentionally trying to create fear of our neighbors because of the color of their skin, the accent they speak with, or where they happen to be born. And then we saw, and this is nothing new to you all, about the surges that we saw in Chicago, in Minneapolis. And I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to go to both places, fortunate enough to see the tragedy on the ground, but be surrounded by organizers, community members who are organizing their communities to stand up to try to protect their neighbors under assault. And the work that I got to see was rooms like this, in houses, in places of worship, in community seminars, in the back of Vietnamese restaurants, where regular neighbors, people just like you, got together and decided that they had had enough, that they wanted to protect and love their neighbor. And they were going to go out in bitter cold and do whatever it took to make sure that their neighbors felt safe and welcomed. And they won, to a degree. They forced the administration to think about shifting those tactics. But that shift looks like a bit more of quieter mass deportations and a shift to bureaucratic elimination of status. What does that mean? So I think about this as the mass deportation machine. There are different buckets about the way that deportations are continuing to happen, but they're happening in a quieter way that isn't going to get the front page news of what we saw in Minneapolis. And I want to name this because if it's not in the forefront of our mind, we still need to understand that this is continuing to happen at scale. So this is a massive expansion of detention about holding people in facilities, often facilities that are not fit for human habitation. We are also seeing a massive expansion of ICE surveillance and weaponizing of data, of taking security cam footage, about weaponizing all the different forms of government data and compiling it to find and locate our neighbors. And we think about these 287G agreements. I know at previous talks here, folks talked about 287G agreements. If you don't know, it is an agreement of which that the local police then can act as ICE agents. And while that might seem a little bit benign, what that actually leads to in practice is encourages the local police or mandates the local police, depending on the location, to create a show me your papers situation so that you get pulled over for a taillight, that you get stopped by any local interaction. Now all of a sudden you have to prove your citizenship. Or it, in many cases that we've seen across the country, it amounts to racial profiling. I'm going to talk to you because of the accent that you speak with. I'm going to now question your right to belong. And there's been a massive expansion of these. Over 1,200 new agreements in new counties around these 287G agreements across the country. New ones are being signed every single day. Then I want to talk about the bureaucratic assault on status. That's a fancy way to think about how the mechanisms, without passing massive laws, are slowly using the bureaucracy of government to erode people's status. They are making people have a forced choice of, do I self-deport? Do I self-do family separation? Or do I continue to try to live in fear and lose my legal status? That is because they're slow walking deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, so dreamers. So now if you have a dreamer status that has to get renewed every 2 years, the government is slow walking those applications by months and months and months, that people are going and losing that status completely, losing their job, losing the ability to work legally inside the United States. There's also the elimination of TPS, or temporary protected status. That's 103 million of our neighbors who currently have the ability to have work permits and have a level of protected status that is going to get eliminated over the next year. There's the dismantling of asylum, there's travel bans, and there is now shifts in green card applications. So if you are like my wife, who needed to apply to be able to get a green card, they are now trying to figure out if she would have to return to her home country for some indeterminate amount of time during that process to be able to apply. They'd have to be separated from my wife for months on end, with the hope that they'll fill out some paperwork and we can be back together. There is now denaturalizations, and there's attacks on the 14th Amendment. There's calls for 100 million deportations. And while the attacks on the 14th Amendment, those numbers of deportations might not actually materialize in the real aspects, it is nevertheless an indeterminate threat. Because if we think about the ability for the government to strip legal status, citizenship of our neighbors, even the ones by law, by the 14th Amendment, have created a level of citizenship, there is an extreme downstream threat that comes from that. And even if they don't win on this court case around the 14th Amendment, and they're probably not going to, we've advanced that conversation into the mainstream that there are people who are considered, quote unquote, un-Americans. People who have citizenship, people who are our neighbors, who call this place home for their whole life. We are now having that conversation of permanent foreignness. And I think it's really important for us to think about where we're at. So we could also think about the Tennessee plan. And if folks have not been following what's happening in Tennessee, I think it is really important as a foreshadow of what might be able to come. In Tennessee, they have stripped and re-gerrymandered districts to stop the ability for folks to have the ability to have congressional representation, or making it extremely difficult. They have also put fines in law for not reporting somebody's status based upon use of public services. What does that mean? I go into an emergency room service. If I'm in Tennessee, now the doctor, the nurse, the practitioner, they could face fines and jail time for not reporting somebody's immigration status for receiving those services. That is the law in Tennessee right now. They also passed a statewide 287G. So any officer inside of Tennessee is now doing show me your papers. They're doing racial profiling. They are asking everybody about their citizenship. They have created a 25-foot law That means we can't interact with law enforcement or do some of the documentation that we saw in Chicago and Minneapolis. And they admitted a crime to release information about ICE. This is a way to think about how do you stop the level of accountability for public officers. They're also investigating nonprofit organizations from the state government. And there's an asterisk here, if you can see that, about checking immigration status from public school kids. I don't know what says boot kids. This is, I'm dyslexic, and my ability to get slides is always a little bit of a challenge. But they are a way to check status to remove kids from public education. Now, that didn't pass the legislature this time, but they keep trying it session after session in Tennessee. And that's the ability to remove immigrant kids from public education, to remove funding from public education, so that the 80% of American kids who go to public school, that funding is start to slowly erode, particularly in communities where that school is a central pillar of the community. And so I do all of this, right, to think about, this is not what we're talking about immigration policy. We're not talking about whether or not somebody has a policy in the way of like who can come and filling out a form and to getting in line, or to think about the number of people that can come. There is reasonable people can debate differences about immigration policy and reform. But I think the sum total of what we are seeing from Tennessee, from across the country, is something different. And I think that is something different in a way to redefine who gets to be a quote unquote real American, with the most exclusionary version that leaves so many American families outside of that version of who is a real American. And why do they target our immigrant neighbors? It is designed to purge those they consider un-American from public life. And I think it is important for many of us, or at least somebody like myself who was born here, has immigration status. My family lineage comes literally on the Mayflower. But it's really important that we think about this, because we're not just targeting our immigrant neighbors. It's not just about them over there. This is a way to a design as a justification to start to slowly erode the rights and freedoms and democracy of us all. So I like to think about what we are up against really is this tug of war. It's this tug of war between movements of democracy and movements of authoritarianism. And it is this push and pull back and forth. And the terrain on which this contest is fought is the terrain on immigration. It is a tug of war between, do we think about our neighbors as invaders, or do we think about our neighbors as neighbors? So I think we think about these big ethereal terms of democracy, of authoritarianism. They can feel really big and like abstract. And so I often like to define what I mean by these terms of authoritarianism and democracy. But I think the modern American authoritarian movement seeks to concentrate power and profit into the hands of a few, severely limiting the rights, freedoms of who gets to identify as an American, particularly leveraging white nationalist ideas to advance their goals. But I think about democracy movements, and democracy not as contained to the idea of voting, but democracy is distributing power and profit to working families, where we get to have the decisions have meaningful impact in all of the decisions that get our lives, and to expand the idea of Americanism to our neighbors. So if you were to kind of think about this a little bit more in contrast, I like to think about it in two terms of the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. Democracy is about distributive power. Authoritarianism is about concentrated power. But I also think about it in terms of citizenship. Authoritarian movements want to reduce citizenship, and democracy movements want to expand citizenship. And I don't just mean citizenship as a quality of immigration status, but the ability of a citizen to have good health care, access to affordable education, good jobs. Like, there is a form of citizenship that we need to expand, that we need to demand, that allows us to have more fulfilled and rich lives, to take care of one another. So why immigration? Why target immigrants? And I think this is important to think about if there's an authoritarian movement thinking about the concentration of power and profit. So why go after immigrants specifically? Because the fundamental argument, the justification for authoritarian power is that they need a perpetual villain. They need somebody to be able to go after. Because why give up my rights and freedoms unless there is a boogeyman over there that I need you to protect me from? And so this perpetual villain happens because authoritarians never actually get to the part where they make it better for all the real Americans. Because if it's better, then why keep giving up my rights and freedoms? And so whether today the immigrant is how we depict an immigrant in our minds, that perpetual villain will continue to change. They will continue to go after new villains as a justification for staying in power. But why does this work? And I think this is important for us to think about because the thought that our neighbors or maybe you have inside of your head or family members might have that are thinking, well, I don't know, maybe taking in by some of these ideas is because this isn't Fox News like manipulating a bunch of rubes and a bunch of thicky dum-dums. This is actually about a movement that is speaking to real conditions that are facing our neighbors, that we face ourselves. And I think about these as popular anxieties. To some degree or another, we all feel a little bit of anxiety about material stability. And the authoritarian argument says if we get rid of all the un-Americans, well then housing prices will go down and wages will go up. It's a nice story, convincing, speaking to a real issue that people have. Just happens to be not true. We also have these around personal and community safety. We all want to feel those ways. We also want to have a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And authoritarian movements are speaking and agitating these anxieties that we all feel to bring folks into a movement. Because I think it is important we think that we're up against a movement. That's why I do this tug of war back and forth. It's not just a man, it's not just administration, it's not just a small group of people, but it is a social movement thinking about how do we want to reorganize society. And I think why that is extremely important for us to think about is because there is a response. There is another movement response that can pull in a different direction, about a movement response that can expand democracy, can expand citizenship. And it actually gives me a little bit of hope. And even beyond hope, because I know that we can win. I know that the forces of authoritarianism isn't permanent, isn't written into history, because heroic Americans have done this before. They have organized together to demand that more people in our country who call it home have full participation, from people of color to women. Different times in our history, we have done this. We've expanded democracy. We've expanded it to see the fuller picture of what America looks like. And more recent history has shown that this is possible. As I mentioned in Minneapolis and Chicago, regular neighbors coming together, organizing together as neighbors, as community members, standing up and protecting one another. That is shown to be working. And what they've been doing is they've been doing these things called community defense networks. It's a fancy term for what is a strategy that is being implemented all across the country. Folks locally here in Johnson County, in KCK, on the Missouri side, but in Toledo and Cincinnati, as far away as Boise, there is communities all across the country who are coming together in this sort of strategy. They might not all call it community defense networks. This is kind of the fancy term that we come up with. We do a lot of training on how to put these things together. But a community defense network is a group of people aligned by place and purpose to expand a community's capacity to support and protect neighbors, to build power to demand a more robust democracy and resist authoritarian movements in their many forms. And I think this is a strategy that is really helpful for us to think about in this moment. We can scroll online. Tomorrow, I'm sure there is going to be another news story of another horror. It is deeply, overwhelming to think about this moment. And it feels so big and so much out of our control. And I think what these community defense networks are, these groups of neighbors coming together, is a way how we bring that back together. We make it localized. It is actually neighbors protecting neighbors and thinking about how do we stand together in moments of crisis to look out and reach out for one another. And that thinking about place and purpose together. And I think that is something that's really powerful in this moment. Because why we think about these as the model that I think are important to think about in this moment, to think about how we are responding to these overwhelming threats around immigration. If that upsets you, I don't think that's right. That's not the way I want my neighbors to be treated. These are a model, a structure, of way to start to think about how you can do something about it. Because these aren't somebody else's problems. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires your engagement. Every single one of you to engage in this process. Because authoritarians get a foothold when we're terrified of our neighbors, when we think about the people on our street, the people in our congregation, the people that we see at the grocery store as strangers. And partly what this organizing model is to say, how do you be adaptive in your place, your people around you, to build something out, to start to build a community of neighborliness, to overcome the idea of a stranger. And because this isn't a formalized supermodel here, there's some different structures I won't go into too much. But if you find yourself thinking, Zach, I'd really like to get involved. I want to actually take action with my neighbors, but that feels really overwhelming and really difficult. We do lots of trainings on this. Happy to do a personalized training for you in your neighborhood anytime that you'd like. But I do these trainings all across the country. And every community is beautifully unique. There are challenges, there are difficulties, there are things that each community needs to overcome. But there are also powerful pieces that each community uniquely has that are able to create the ability to build this sort of neighborliness, to stand up, to protect our neighbors in this moment, that I think are really important. Because there isn't a right way to fight for democracy. There isn't a right, correct way to do this. But there is a way we can build on small wins. You're never going to get in the newspaper, you're not going to read, and you're not going to pull up and say, great, my community had a meeting of 5 people last week. This month, it's 10 people. That's never going to be in the papers. But that is a small win of coming together, of seeing neighbors. I think about the Community Defense Network here locally in KCK that I'm involved in. And we got together as strangers at the beginning of the year, started to build each other up as neighbors. And it was a lot. Think about, how do we protect all of the immigrants in KCK? That's too big. It's too big even for us. And so we started to think about, well, how do we protect 6 families? How do we support 6 families, 6 neighbors? Can we organize to protect 6 neighbors? And if that's all that we do all year, is make sure that 6 families of our neighbors feel a little bit less alone, a little bit less scared, and a little bit more powered to have the ability to say that I should have meaningful participation in the decisions that govern my life, then that is a huge win. And I know I said this before, and this is what I'll close on, is that, yes, I have hope that we can win. But I often find that I don't need or reach for hope. Because we've done this. We can do this if we have the courage to do that. Because I think what authoritarian movements inside of the mainstream force us to have to ask is they ask us a question about courage. And I don't mean the courage that looks like a superhero film, or even the courage of like running up and filming an ICE officer. That might take a level of courage. But I'm talking about the day-to-day courage it takes to know that there is big, massive threats facing our neighbors, facing our communities, and have the courage to try. Have the courage to show up and show up again and show up again. Because the one thing I can guarantee is that if you all take action, organize with neighbors, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to mess it up. And that's okay. But courage, I think, in this moment is to say that that meeting was a little awkward, or we didn't have enough people out, or it doesn't feel right. But it is the courage of building movements to be able to do that over and over again. And there's a reverend from Tennessee, wrote an op-ed. It's been really sticky in the back of my mind. And he talked about Freedom Summer. And he said there was never any certainty in building those movements. There was never any certainty that we were going to get the Civil Rights Act, that we were going to overthrow Jim Crow. There was never certainty that we were going to win. But there was commitment. And I think that's what requires us in this moment. When we think about the immigration policies, when we think about the policies of different things that are happening over and over again, that we're like, this is not right, it is not okay. We've got to have the courage to make the commitment to do something about it without the certainty to know that we will get to the promised land. Thanks.